Welcome to an Ontotext GraphDB Fundamentals training class. In this video, we will give a brief overview of GraphDB installation. Let's get started. The installation process for GraphDB consists of 5 basic steps. First, you need to download GraphDB SE and unzip the downloaded file. Next, you will need to deploy the WAR files on an application server. Third, you will launch the GraphDB Workbench. Fourth, you will need to create a database and a repository. Finally, you will want to execute SPARQL queries to test your installation. This installation process assumes you have Apache Tomcat version 7 or greater on your system and that you are installing GraphDB SE. Let's assume you have completed Step 1, which involves downloading GraphDB SE and unzipping the downloaded file. Now, for Step 2, you need to deploy the WAR files on Tomcat. To deploy the WAR files on Tomcat, simply copy the files from the Sesame GraphDB folder to the Web Apps folder on Tomcat. As you can see below, we have highlighted the WAR files in blue. After copying the files, you may need to restart Tomcat. As an alternative, you may choose to deploy the WAR files using the Tomcat Management Console, which we demonstrate on the next slide. It's convenient and easy to deploy the WAR files directly from Tomcat using the Tomcat Management Console. Simply go to http localhost 8080. Click Manage Your App. Then, for each of the WAR files, click on Navigate to WAR File Deploy. Choose and deploy the WAR files. After you have finished deploying the WAR files, click GraphDB Workbench SE to open GraphDB Workbench. For the next step in the installation process, we want to create a new repository. On the previous slide, we launched the GraphDB Workbench. Once the application is open, we select Admin from the tabs at the top of the screen. Next, we select or click Locations and Repositories. Then, we configure the new repository, selecting Create Repository, filling in the needed repository information, and finally clicking Create. Our repository is now created. Finally, for the last step, we want to test the repository. To perform the test, we first select SPARQL, shown at the top of the screen. Next, we write and execute SPARQL queries. In our example shown on the bottom left, we wrote a query to insert data about the Flintstones. And we also want to test the repository by writing a query that selects information. An example is shown on the bottom right, where we write a query to list Fred Flintstone's grandchildren. When our executed queries return the expected correct results, we know our GraphDB installation is successful. And that concludes our brief overview of a GraphDB installation. We hope you enjoyed this Ontotext video. Thank you for listening.